In the late 1800s, the American West was a wild and restless land. Towns were growing fast, trains were roaring through the open plains, and danger was never too far away. It was a time when justice often depended on who could draw their gun the fastest, and when ordinary men could become legends or outlaws. Among these men were three brothers who would go down in history as both heroes and villains. Their names were Bob Dalton, Grat Dalton, and Emmett Dalton, the infamous Dalton Gang. But before they became outlaws, they were lawmen. And their story didn't begin with crime. It began with duty, family, and a dream for a better life. The Dalton family came from humble beginnings. They were poor farmers living in the rugged land of Kansas. Their father, Lewis Dalton, was a hard-working man, and their mother, Adeline, was strong and determined. She raised her sons to be tough, loyal, and protective of one another. Life was never easy. The family moved often, chasing work, chasing hope. Every day was a struggle to survive. Droughts, debts, and long winters made sure of that. But through all the hardship, the Dalton boys grew up with one belief, that they could make something of themselves. The older brothers became cowhands and ranch workers. Some joined law enforcement. They wore badges, carried pistols, and swore to protect others from the chaos that ruled the frontier, and for a time, they did. But the West was changing fast. Towns were filled with gamblers, thieves, and drifters looking for easy money. Train robberies were becoming common. Lawmen were underpaid, overworked, and often abandoned by the very system they served. For the Dalton brothers, it was a harsh life. They risked their lives every day for a few dollars. They saw criminals living richer, freer lives, robbing banks, stealing trains, and vanishing into the open plains with thousands in gold. It started to eat away at them. The Dalton brothers weren't born outlaws. They were pushed there, by hunger, by greed, and by the wild spirit of the West itself. Bob Dalton, the most daring of them all, was young and full of pride. He had been a deputy U.S. Marshal, chasing dangerous men across the Indian Territory. But he began to see the injustice of it all, criminals living like kings while lawmen died broke. Grat Dalton, his older brother, was quieter but loyal. He followed Bob even when he knew the path was dangerous. And Emmett, the youngest, admired them both. To him, his brothers were heroes. He never imagined how their choices would change his life forever. In those days, many men wore a badge by day and broke the law by night. The line between justice and crime was thin, and the Dalton brothers were about to cross it. Their first steps into outlaw life were small, helping friends, turning a blind eye, cutting corners. But soon they began working with men who had no badges at all. Rumors spread of a new gang forming, men who knew the law too well to ever get caught. They knew where the trains ran, when the guards changed, and how the system worked from the inside. They called themselves the Dalton Gang. The gang's first real crime came in 1891. Under the cover of darkness, they rode toward a Southern Pacific train in California. Their plan was simple: stop the train, grab the money, and disappear before dawn. But plans rarely go as expected. As the train slowed down, the Daltons and their partners climbed aboard. The conductor panicked, shots were fired, and chaos broke out. Smoke, shouting, horses, everything happened fast. When it was over, the gang had escaped with thousands of dollars. No one could believe it. The Dalton brothers, once U.S. Marshals, had robbed a train. Newspapers across the West exploded with headlines. The Dalton Gang was born, and America suddenly had new outlaws to fear. Some people compared them to Jesse James, the legendary outlaw who had died just years before. But others said the Daltons were even bolder, more reckless, more dangerous. To the brothers, fame was thrilling. But for Bob Dalton, it wasn't enough. He didn't want to be another outlaw. He wanted to be remembered forever. He told his gang he would beat Jesse James's record. He wanted to pull off a robbery so big, so impossible, that the world would never forget the Dalton name. As the months went by, the Dalton Gang's reputation grew. They robbed trains across Oklahoma and Kansas, sometimes without firing a single bullet. The law chased them, but the Daltons always slipped away. Fast horses, hidden trails, and local sympathizers kept them one step ahead. But every success only made Bob hungrier for glory. And every robbery brought them closer to disaster. There were whispers that Bob was changing, becoming colder, crueler, obsessed with fame. Grat tried to reason with him, but Bob wouldn't listen. Emmett, still loyal to his brothers, followed them deeper into the outlaw life. They didn't realize that their destiny was waiting in a quiet little town called Coffeyville, Kansas, the same town where they had grown up, the same streets they had played on as children, and the place where it would all come to an end. The Dalton Gang had crossed the line. There was no going back now, and soon the law, and fate itself, would catch up with them. The Dalton brothers had crossed the line. Once they wore badges, now they wore masks, and after that first train robbery, there was no turning back. Their names were whispered in saloons and sheriff's offices all across the West. Bob, Great, and Emmett Dalton, the brothers who had betrayed the law. But to the Dalton Gang, this was only the beginning. The year was 1891, and the American frontier was still wild. Trains carried money, gold, and mail across hundreds of miles of open land. Robbing one was dangerous, but it was also the fastest way to get rich. The Daltons had learned from their first job. They studied every route, every guard schedule, every pattern. They planned with precision, knowing the risks but chasing the reward. For them, crime had become an adventure, a game of survival and strategy. Bob Dalton was the leader, ambitious, daring, and proud. He dreamed big, too big. He wanted to outdo Jesse James, the most famous outlaw in America. To Bob, the Dalton Gang wasn't just a group of thieves. It was a legacy, a name that would echo in history. Grat Dalton, the older brother, followed him faithfully. Grat was steady, practical, but loyal to a fault. He believed in Bob, even when others began to doubt him. And then there was Emmett, young, hopeful, and still searching for his place. He didn't love crime. He loved his brothers, and that love would soon cost him everything. The Daltons weren't alone. They recruited others who shared their hunger for danger and wealth. Among them were Bill Power, a quiet man with quick reflexes, and Dick Broadwell, a loyal friend who'd known the brothers since childhood. Together, they became a family bound by crime, living on the run, sleeping under the stars, and trusting no one outside their circle. But even in this life of danger, there was excitement. Every train robbery brought money, fame, and that strange thrill of beating the system. Their next big job came later that year. Another train robbery, this time near Wharton, in the Indian Territory. The plan was simple: stop the train, take the money, and vanish into the darkness. But nothing ever goes perfectly in the Wild West. The gang misjudged the timing. The guards were more alert than expected. Shots were fired. Yet, by the time dawn broke, the Dalton Gang had disappeared, leaving behind a train full of terrified passengers and a trail of smoke. They had done it again. The newspapers were obsessed. "The Daltons strike again!" screamed the headlines. Suddenly, everyone knew their name. Sheriffs from 3 states formed posses to track them down. Rewards were offered, but the Daltons always seemed to vanish into the hills, escaping every trap. To the public, they became both villains and heroes. Some saw them as criminals. Others saw them as rebels, men fighting against a system that had failed them. And in the shadows, Bob Dalton smiled. Because this was exactly what he wanted: fame. At night, around their campfires, the brothers would talk about their future. Grat worried about the law catching up. Emmett wondered if they should give up and start fresh somewhere far away. But Bob's eyes always burned with something else, a dream of greatness. He once told them, "If we're going down as legends." Those words stayed with them and would lead them straight into history. The Dalton Gang's success made them overconfident. They robbed trains in Red Rock and Adair, Oklahoma, stealing thousands in cash and gold. Each robbery was faster, cleaner, more dangerous. But each one also drew more attention from the law. Detectives from the Southern Pacific Railroad and U.S. Marshals began working together to hunt them down. Posters with their faces appeared in every town. Bounties reached into the thousands. The Daltons were now the most wanted men in the West. One by one, the world started closing in on them. Friends turned away. Informants appeared. Even members of their own gang began to feel the pressure. Bob's temper grew shorter. Grat's patience wore thin. Emmett, still loyal, watched his brothers change under the weight of fear and pride. There was no longer room for mistakes, but mistakes were coming. One night, hiding out after another robbery, Bob told the gang his next plan. It would be the biggest heist ever attempted in the Wild West. He wanted to rob 2 banks at the same time, in broad daylight, in their own hometown of Coffeyville, Kansas. Everyone was shocked. It was insane. Why Coffeyville? Why home? Bob said it was poetic, that if they succeeded, they'd make history. But deep down, Grat and Emmett knew it was pride, not reason, driving their brother. Still, they agreed. Because the Dalton brothers had always stood together, through law, through crime, through blood. As the sun rose on that fateful October morning in 1892, the Dalton gang saddled their horses for what would be their final ride. The air was cool, the sky clear, and destiny was waiting. Bob adjusted his hat, smiled at his brothers, and said, "Let's make this one count." They didn't know it yet, but by the end of that day, 4 of them would be dead, and the Dalton gang, the brothers who dreamed of fame, would become legends written in blood. October 5th, 1892. A cool morning sun rises over Coffeyville, Kansas. A quiet town, just waking up. Shopkeepers open their doors, children hurry to school, and trains whistle in the distance. No one knows that death is riding toward them. No one knows that today, the Dalton gang will attempt something so bold, so dangerous, it will shock the entire country. They plan to rob 2 banks at the same time. 5 men ride together through the mist. Bob Dalton, the leader, young, proud, and hungry for glory. Grat Dalton, his older brother, calm, quiet, but weary. Emmett Dalton, the youngest, loyal, innocent at heart. And their partners, Bill Power and Dick Broadwell, both armed and ready. They have planned this for weeks. They know every street, every building, every face. Coffeyville is their home, and that's what makes this plan both brilliant and deadly. The plan is simple on paper. The gang will ride into town disguised with long coats and fake beards. They'll tie their horses in an alley behind the banks, split up, and strike both places at once. Then they'll regroup and escape before anyone knows what happened. But there's one problem. Coffeyville isn't just any town. It's full of people who know them. As the gang rides down the main street, a store clerk looks up from his window. He squints. He knows that walk. He knows those eyes. "Hey, isn't that Bob Dalton?" he whispers. Within minutes, whispers spread through the town like wildfire. People rush to grab rifles. Store owners lock their doors. The quiet morning turns into a storm about to explode. Music rises, faster tempo. Sounds of footsteps, doors slamming, guns being loaded. Narrator. The Dalton brothers reach the alley behind C.M. Condon Bank and First National Bank. They tie their horses to a post, but it's too far away from the street. A small mistake that will soon cost them their lives. Bob and Emmett head to one bank. Grat, Power, and Broadwell move to the other. The heist begins. Inside the First National Bank, Bob Dalton points his gun at the cashier. "Fill that sack and it's fast," he growls. The terrified teller obeys, hands shaking. Emmett guards the door, trying to calm the customers. Across the street, Grat Dalton shouts for the safe to be opened. But the teller lies. He says the time lock won't open for 10 minutes. Grat curses, pacing back and forth. The plan is already falling apart. Outside, townspeople have surrounded the banks. The hardware store owner, Mr. Isham, hands out rifles to anyone brave enough to fight. Men take cover behind barrels, wagons, and fences. One man whispers, "Let's end this once and for all." The clock strikes 9. And the battle begins. Bullets tear through windows and walls. Smoke fills the air. The once peaceful town becomes a war zone. Bob and Emmett try to escape with their loot, but as they step into the street, shots explode all around them. Emmett feels a burning pain in his arm. Bob fires back, shouting orders. Across the street, Grat Dalton and his men run into the same hell. Bill Power is hit in the chest. Broadwell takes a bullet to the back. Blood stains the dusty road. Within minutes, the Dalton gang is trapped. Every escape route is blocked. The people of Coffeyville, shopkeepers, farmers, fathers, are fighting like soldiers. Bob tries to reach his horse, but he's shot again and again. Grat collapses near the bank steps. Emmett, desperate, runs to help his brother, but a shotgun blast rips through his side. He falls beside Bob, bleeding, gasping for air, and then silence. The gunfire stops. When the smoke clears, 4 outlaws lie dead on the ground. Bob Dalton, Grat Dalton, Bill Power, and Dick Broadwell. Only Emmett Dalton is still alive, his body riddled with bullets. The townspeople stare in shock. The famous Dalton Gang, the men who had robbed trains and defied the law, were gone in less than 15 minutes. The people of Coffeyville bury the dead outlaws in simple graves. Reporters from across the country arrive to tell the story. They call it the end of the Dalton Gang. The photos of their lifeless bodies are printed in newspapers everywhere. To some, they're proof that justice had won. To others, they're a sad reminder that greed and pride always lead to the same fate. Emmett Dalton, the lone survivor, is taken to prison. He spends 14 years behind bars, haunted by the memory of his brothers. But he never forgets their bond or their dream. When he's finally released, he tells his story to the world. He writes books, appears in movies, and spends the rest of his life warning others about the choices that destroyed his family. The Coffeyville raid ended more than just a gang. It marked the end of an era, the death of the Wild West itself. The Dalton brothers wanted to become legends. And in a way, they did. Not for their gold or their guns, but for the story of how three brothers chased fame and found tragedy instead. When the dust settled in Coffeyville, 4 men were dead. The Dalton Gang, once the most feared outlaws in the West, had fallen. Only one man was still breathing, lying in the dirt, broken and bleeding. That man was Emmett Dalton. He had been shot more than 20 times. His body was shattered, but somehow he was still alive. The townspeople gathered around him, staring in disbelief. This was the youngest Dalton, the one who had followed his brothers out of loyalty, not greed. Now, as the last survivor, he was about to face the price of everything they had done. The doctors said he wouldn't make it through the night. But Emmett refused to die. For days he drifted in and out of consciousness, fighting the pain, remembering every gunshot, every scream. He thought about his brothers, Bob and Grat, lying cold in their graves. He thought about their mother who had warned them that pride would destroy them. And he thought about the life they could have had if they had stayed on the right side of the law. Against all odds, he survived. But surviving meant facing justice. Emmett Dalton was sentenced to life in prison for robbery and murder. He was taken to the Kansas State Penitentiary, still weak and scarred. The iron gates closed behind him, and the world he knew disappeared. For the first time in his life, he was completely alone. Inside those walls, Emmett was no longer an outlaw. He was just another prisoner, another number in a cell. The guards watched him closely. The other inmates whispered about him. Everyone knew who he was. The last Dalton, the man who had survived the Coffeyville massacre. At first, he was bitter and silent. He didn't speak much. He kept to himself. He carried the guilt of his brothers' deaths like a shadow that never left. But time, as it always does, began to change him. Years passed slowly behind bars. Emmett read books, worked in the prison yard, and started to find peace in small things. The sunrise through the cell window, the sound of birds beyond the walls. He began to reflect on what had happened, not as a hero or a victim, but as a man who had made terrible choices. He realized that his brother's downfall wasn't just caused by greed. It was pride, that dangerous belief that they could outsmart the world, that they were untouchable. Emmett began to understand that real strength didn't come from guns or fame. It came from humility, from knowing when to walk away. 14 years later, something remarkable happened. Emmett Dalton was granted parole. The governor believed he had changed, that he was no longer the reckless boy who rode into Coffeyville with a gun in his hand. When Emmett stepped out of prison, the world had changed completely. The Wild West was gone. Trains were faster, towns were larger, and the old frontier had become history. He was no longer an outlaw. He was a relic of a past era. But he was determined not to waste his second chance. Emmett moved to California and began rebuilding his life. He stayed out of trouble, worked hard, and tried to live quietly. But the name Dalton still followed him. People wanted to hear his story. Reporters, writers, even movie studios. Everyone wanted to know what it had been like to be part of the infamous Dalton Gang. At first, Emmett refused to talk. He didn't want to glorify what they had done. He knew that behind every headline there was blood, pain, and regret. But eventually he realized that telling the truth could help others learn from his mistakes. So, he began to write. In 1918, Emmett published his first book, Beyond the Law. It told his side of the story, how three brothers went from wearing badges to becoming outlaws. He described their childhood, their choices, and the terrible end in Coffeyville. It was honest, painful, and full of lessons about pride, family, and fate. The book became a success. Readers were fascinated by the idea that an outlaw could speak with such remorse and wisdom. For the first time, Emmett wasn't being hunted, he was being heard. A few years later, he wrote another book, When the Daltons Rode, which gave even deeper insight into their lives. It was later turned into a Hollywood movie, and Emmett himself worked as a consultant on set. The same man who once ran from the law was now standing behind a camera, helping tell his own story to the world. People who met him in his later years said he was calm, gentle, and thoughtful. He often told young people to stay away from the path he had taken. He said that fame built on fear never lasts, and that there's no glory in dying for pride. He also spoke about his brothers, not as criminals, but as men who lost their way. He said they weren't born bad. They were shaped by a world that rewarded violence and punished honesty. He wanted people to remember them not just for how they died, but for how they lived before the darkness took over. Emmett Dalton lived a long life. He died in 1937 at the age of 66, the last living link to one of the most famous outlaw gangs in American history. He was buried quietly, far from Coffeyville, far from the memories of that bloody morning, but his story, and the story of his brothers, never truly died. It lives on in books, in films, and in the legends of the Old West. Because the tale of the Dalton Gang isn't just about crime. It's about family, ambition, and the dangerous dream of becoming something greater than you are. It's a story of how love and loyalty can blind men, and how one man, scarred and broken, found redemption in the ruins of his past. The Dalton Gang's tale ended in gunfire, but Emmett Dalton's story ended in peace. He proved that even the darkest life can find light again. That even a man with 20 bullets in his body and a lifetime of regret can still choose to change. That's the real legacy of the Dalton Gang. Not how they died, but how one of them chose to live. Long before the gunfights, the robberies, and the headlines, the Dalton brothers were just boys. They were born into a world that was harsh, unpredictable, and unforgiving, a world that shaped who they would become. Their story didn't begin with crime. It began with family, survival, and the struggle of ordinary people trying to make it in a restless new land. The Dalton family lived on the edge of the American frontier. Their father, Lewis Dalton, was a hard-working man, a farmer, a gambler, and a dreamer, who believed that luck would one day turn in his favor. Their mother, Adeline Dalton, was strong, proud, and fiercely protective of her 13 children. She was the kind of woman who could run a household, raise a family, and still find time to nurse the sick or help a neighbor in need. The Daltons moved often, chasing opportunity from Missouri to Kansas, and later into Indian Territory, today's Oklahoma. They were poor but hopeful, like many families of that time. The Civil War had left the country divided and broken, and survival meant working hard, fighting for every dollar, and trusting only those you loved. The boys grew up in the open fields, learning how to ride horses before they could even read. They hunted for food, mended fences, and helped their father with whatever work he could find. Life on the frontier taught them toughness and independence, but it also taught them to rely on one another. From the very beginning, the Dalton brothers were close. Bob, Grat, and Emmett were part of a big family, but their bond was special. Bob was clever and ambitious, always dreaming of something bigger. Grat was steady and calm, a man of few words but strong convictions. And Emmett, the youngest, looked up to his older brothers like heroes. They were ordinary boys with extraordinary spirit, the kind who wanted to carve their own path in a world that didn't give much to anyone. As teenagers, the brothers saw the rise of lawlessness around them. The Wild West was still wild, full of saloons, bandits, and drifting cowboys looking for trouble. Every town had a sheriff, but not enough deputies. Train robbers and cattle thieves were getting rich, while honest men barely scraped by. To their mother's relief, some of her sons decided to work for the law. Before Bob, Grat, and Emmett ever broke it, they actually upheld it. Several of the older Dalton brothers, including Frank Dalton, joined law enforcement. Frank became a deputy U.S. Marshal serving in Indian Territory. He was brave, respected, and determined to bring justice to the frontier. But in 1887, tragedy struck. Frank Dalton was killed in a gunfight with outlaws near Fort Smith, Arkansas. He was shot multiple times while trying to make an arrest. News of his death shattered the Dalton family. To his younger brothers, Frank had been a hero, a man who stood for something good in a bad world. His death changed them forever. After Frank's death, Bob and Grat Dalton decided to take his place. They became deputy marshals too, believing they could honor their brother's memory. At first, they worked hard and made arrests, chasing horse thieves and whiskey smugglers through the dusty plains. But the job was dangerous and poorly paid. They risked their lives every day, earning just a few dollars for every criminal they caught. And sometimes the criminals had friends, dangerous men who didn't forget who had locked them up. The pressure grew heavier, the rewards grew smaller, and the line between justice and survival began to blur. Bob Dalton was the first to start questioning the system. He saw rich men getting away with crimes, while honest deputies struggled to feed their families. He saw outlaws living freely, spending money they stole, and being celebrated as heroes by the newspapers. He began to wonder, what was the point of dying poor for a law that didn't care about you? Grat was hesitant. He still believed in doing what was right, but Bob's words had a way of convincing people. He was charming, persuasive, and full of restless ambition. And Emmett, still young and impressionable, trusted his brothers more than anyone else in the world. It was Bob's growing frustration and his desire to prove himself that slowly pulled them away from the badge and toward the gun. On the frontier also had another effect on them. They were surrounded by stories of men who had become famous through crime. Jesse James, the younger brothers, and other outlaws who had turned their names into legends. Bob admired them. He didn't just want money. He wanted recognition, power, and respect. He wanted people to remember the Dalton name. What began as small acts of rebellion soon turned into something much larger. A stolen horse here, a favor for a friend there. They told themselves it was just to get by, that it wasn't real crime. But once you take the first step across that line, it's hard to turn back. By the early 1890s, the Dalton brothers had changed. They were still young, Bob barely in his 20s, but life had hardened them. They had seen death, injustice, and disappointment. They had tried to do good and been punished for it. So they decided to take what they thought the world owed them. That decision would make them legends, but it would also destroy them. The same courage that had made them strong deputies now made them fearless outlaws. The same loyalty that once united them as brothers would lead them together into disaster, and the same hunger for freedom that once drove them west would become the fire that burned everything they loved. The Dalton brothers didn't start as criminals. They started as sons, as brothers, as men trying to survive in a land that offered no mercy. But the West was a place that changed people. It could turn heroes into killers, and dreamers into legends. In the next episode, the Daltons take their first step into the dark. The badge falls away, and the outlaw life begins. Every story of downfall begins with one decision, one step too far. For the Dalton brothers, that step came in the year 1891. It was the moment they crossed the line, from men of the law to men hunted by it. The Dalton Gang was about to be born, but it didn't happen overnight. It began slowly, quietly, with frustration, desperation, and a dangerous sense of pride. In those days, Bob Dalton was still a deputy marshal. He had chased outlaws across the Indian Territory, tracked bandits through deserts, and faced gunfire more than once. But the job no longer felt noble. He was tired of risking his life for little pay. The law paid him $2.50 per arrest, barely enough to survive. Meanwhile, the very men he hunted were growing rich off stolen money. They rode fine horses, wore good clothes, and drank the best whiskey in every saloon. And when they were caught, they often found ways to buy their freedom again. To Bob, it began to feel unfair, almost foolish, to keep wearing a badge for men who didn't care if he lived or died. Grat Dalton, his older brother, was the voice of reason. He still believed in honor, even when life gave them little reason to. But Grat also trusted Bob. He had always trusted Bob. And when Bob began to talk about an easier way to make money, Grat listened, even though deep down he knew it was wrong. Emmett Dalton, the youngest, followed without question. He was just a boy compared to the others, eager to prove himself, eager to be part of something bigger. To him, his brothers could do no wrong. He didn't know that his loyalty would soon cost him everything. At first, Bob didn't plan a robbery. He just took small risks, keeping a little extra from a bounty, dealing with men the law usually avoided. It was small corruption, but corruption nonetheless. Then came the moment that changed everything. A friend approached Bob with an offer. Easy money, no blood, no witnesses. All he had to do was help rob a train carrying Southern Pacific Railroad cash in California. It was supposed to be simple. Quick in, quick out. No one would get hurt. Bob convinced Grat and Emmett to join him. They told themselves it was just one job, a chance to escape their debts and start fresh. But once the idea of just one job enters a man's heart, there is no going back. On a cool night in February 1891, the Dalton brothers and a few partners rode out into the darkness. Their target was a mail and express train near the town of Alila, California. It carried bags of money, thousands of dollars guarded by just a few men. Perfect for an ambush. They waited in silence along the tracks, the sound of crickets and wind filling the air. Then in the distance came the whistle, long and low. The train was coming. As the engine slowed to take a curve, the gang rushed in. Guns were drawn, shouts echoed in the night. The fireman and engineer were forced to stop the train. The robbers climbed aboard, demanding the safe be opened, but something went wrong. The safe wouldn't budge, and one nervous guard reached for his weapon. In an instant, gunfire broke out. What was supposed to be a quiet, clean robbery turned into chaos. The Daltons escaped into the darkness with little to show for it. They had stolen only a fraction of what they expected. But it didn't matter. The damage was done. The newspapers soon reported, a train robbed in California, led by former lawmen, the Dalton brothers. The story spread fast. Everyone was shocked. The same men who once served justice were now fugitives. The lawmen had become the outlaws. The Southern Pacific Railroad placed a bounty on their heads. Sheriffs and marshals were ordered to bring them in, dead or alive. The Dalton name, once respected, was now cursed. Their mother, Adeline Dalton, refused to believe it at first. But when she heard the truth, her heart broke. She told her neighbors, "I raised them to be good boys. I don't know where I went wrong." Her sons had entered a world that didn't forgive mistakes, and now they were running. Bob, Grat, and Emmett fled California and headed back east into Indian Territory. There they regrouped and found others willing to ride with them. Men who had lost everything. Men who didn't believe in the law anymore, and men who admired the Daltons for daring to do what others feared. Among them were Dick Broadwell and Bill Power, two old friends from their days in Kansas. Together they formed what would soon be known as the Dalton Gang. Their mission was simple: to live free, to strike fast, and to never get caught. In the months that followed, they planned new robberies. They learned from their mistakes, how to block telegraph lines, how to time train schedules, how to move unseen through the wilderness. Every job was more dangerous than the last, but also more rewarding. Money flowed, fame grew, and fear spread. The Dalton Gang had become a name everyone in the West knew. But with every success, Bob's hunger grew stronger. He wanted more than money. He wanted to be remembered, to outdo every outlaw who had come before him, even Jesse James. He wanted to be a legend. Grat worried that Bob's pride would get them all killed. Emmett stayed silent, torn between fear and loyalty. The gang followed Bob anyway, because he had the fire that made men believe in the impossible. And so, the Dalton brothers, once the sons of a proud mother and the brothers of a fallen marshal, rode deeper into the darkness of their own making. Their first robbery had opened a door they could never close again. The law they once served now hunted them. The line between right and wrong had vanished forever, but they were just getting started. The Dalton Gang's true reign of terror was only beginning, and the world was about to witness the rise of the most daring outlaws in the Wild West. The first crime had been messy, unplanned, and chaotic, but it lit a spark that would soon become a wildfire. In the next episode, the Daltons perfect their craft. Bigger robberies, higher stakes, and a growing obsession with becoming legends. The rise of the Dalton Gang had begun. By the summer of 1891, the Dalton brothers were no longer deputies, no longer lawmen. They were outlaws. The first robbery had turned them into fugitives, but instead of stopping there, they decided to keep going. They had crossed the line once. Now, there was no turning back. Bob Dalton wanted more money, more power, more fame. He wanted to be remembered as the man who could outdo even Jesse James, the most famous outlaw of all time. And so began the true rise of the Dalton Gang. The gang grew quickly. Alongside Bob Gratt and Emmett Dalton, there were now Bill Power and Dick Broadwell, two loyal men who knew how to shoot, ride, and stay quiet. Sometimes they were joined by Bill Doolin, a cowboy who shared their boldness. Together they were young, fast, and fearless. They rode through the Indian Territory, what is now Oklahoma, planning their next big move. They slept under the stars, hid in canyons, and met secretly in abandoned cabins. Every man in the gang knew the risks, but they also knew the reward could change their lives forever. Their next major target was another train. It was risky. Trains were heavily guarded and always on schedule, which made timing everything. But Bob Dalton believed he could outsmart anyone. He had studied the routes, the guards, and even the sound of the engines. He told his gang, "If we're going to rob trains, we'll do it better than anyone else ever has." That confidence, that burning pride, was what made Bob such a powerful leader, and also what would one day destroy him. Late one night in May 1891, near Wharton, Indian Territory, the gang made their move. As the train slowed to take on water, masked men appeared from the shadows. In seconds, the Daltons had the train surrounded. "Hands up!" Bob shouted, his voice echoing in the dark. The guards froze. The passengers cowered in silence. Within minutes, the Daltons had taken thousands of dollars in cash and jewelry, along with the mail sacks full of valuables. They rode off into the night without killing anyone. Fast, clean, and efficient. It was the kind of job that made headlines all over the West. The newspapers couldn't get enough of the story. "The Dalton brothers strike again!" screamed one headline. They called the gang the new Jesse James crew. Reporters compared their daring robberies to the legends of old, and soon, the Dalton Gang became a household name. People admired their courage, even though they were criminals. Some saw them as folk heroes, poor men fighting against a corrupt system. Others saw them for what they were, outlaws living on borrowed time. But the Daltons didn't care what people thought. They cared only about the thrill, the fame, and the freedom of life on the run. Over the next year, the Dalton Gang grew bolder. They robbed trains in Red Rock, Perryville, and Adair, Oklahoma. Their attacks were fast, well-planned, and ruthless. In Adair, they robbed a Missouri-Kansas-Texas train in front of a crowd of witnesses and escaped unharmed. It was one of the most daring heists in Western history. During that robbery, a bullet fired from the gang accidentally killed a doctor standing on the platform. That single death changed the way the public saw them. The line between fame and infamy had finally blurred. The Daltons became wanted men everywhere. The U.S. Marshals, the Pinkerton detectives, and even the railroad companies joined forces to capture them. Posters with their faces hung on walls across Kansas and Oklahoma. The reward money grew higher with every new crime, but somehow the gang always stayed one step ahead. They hid in the hills, blended in with ranchers, and relied on friends who protected them. Bob and Gratt even returned home secretly from time to see their family. Their mother, Adeline, begged them to stop. She told them, "You'll end up like Frank, dead before your time." But Bob wouldn't listen. He believed he could outrun fate itself. By late 1892, the Dalton Gang was the most famous outlaw group in the United States. To some, they were villains. To others, they were legends. But behind the fame, cracks were beginning to show. Gratt Dalton was tired of hiding, tired of running. Emmett, the youngest, still believed in his brothers but began to see the cost of their choices. And Bob? He was obsessed with one last job, one that would make the Daltons immortal. He told his gang that they would do what no one else had ever done before. They would rob 2 banks at the same time, in the same town, in broad daylight. It was insane. Even his own men thought it was suicide, but Bob didn't care. He said, "If we pull this off, no one will ever forget our name." And in that moment, it was clear. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about pride. Emmett tried to talk him out of it. He reminded Bob that their luck couldn't last forever. But Bob laughed and said, "Luck has nothing to do with it. We make our own luck." It was the kind of arrogance that had brought every outlaw before them to ruin. But none of them could stop him. They were brothers, and brothers followed each other to the end. The plan was set. They would strike in Coffeyville, Kansas, their own hometown, the same place where they had once worked, played, and grown up. It was bold, poetic, and foolish all at once. They knew the streets, they knew the people, and they thought that familiarity would give them the advantage. But Coffeyville knew them too, and the town wasn't about to let the Daltons take what wasn't theirs. The Dalton Gang had become legends, young, fearless, and unstoppable. They had robbed trains, humiliated lawmen, and captured the world's attention. But their pride had grown faster than their luck, and soon it would all come crashing down in the streets of Coffeyville. The morning of October 5th, 1892, was calm in Coffeyville, Kansas. The sun rose over the quiet town as people opened their shops, children hurried to school, and horses trotted down dusty streets. No one knew that death was coming. No one knew that the most infamous outlaw gang in America was riding straight toward them. The Dalton Gang was about to attempt something no one had ever done before: rob 2 banks at the same time. Narrator. 5 men rode into Coffeyville that morning: Bob Dalton, Grat Dalton, Emmett Dalton, Bill Power, and Dick Broadwell. They wore long coats and fake beards to hide their faces, but it didn't matter. This was their hometown. Too many people knew them. Their walk, their voices, even the way they carried their guns. Their plan was daring but simple. Bob, Emmett, and Power would rob the First National Bank. Grat and Broadwell would take the CM Condon Bank across the street. They would strike both banks at once, fill their bags with cash, and escape before anyone could react. Then they would ride out of town, vanish into the hills, and become legends forever. At least, that was the plan. As they entered town, something went wrong almost immediately. Their horses couldn't be tied up close to the banks. They had to leave them in an alley farther away. It was a small mistake, but in the world of outlaws, small mistakes mean death. The gang split up, walking casually through the morning crowd. But Coffeyville was a small town and people recognized them. A store clerk whispered, "Aren't those the Dalton boys?" Within minutes, the warning spread. Shopkeepers ran for cover and townsmen reached for their guns. The quiet morning turned into a storm waiting to explode. Inside the First National Bank, Bob Dalton barked orders. "Fill the sacks and make it quick." The terrified teller obeyed. Emmett stood by the door, gun drawn, watching the street. Outside, he could hear shouting. Something was wrong. Across the street, Grat and Broadwell were facing the same problem. The cashier at the CM Condon Bank told them the safe wouldn't open for another 10 minutes. He was lying, buying time. Grat didn't realize it. Every second lost meant more townsmen arming themselves outside. Soon, Coffeyville was ready. Ordinary citizens, clerks, farmers, and shop owners grabbed rifles and revolvers. The hardware store owner, Lucius Baldwin, handed out guns to anyone brave enough to fight. Men took positions behind barrels, wagons, and doorways. They weren't trained soldiers, but they were protecting their town, and they had the element of surprise. When the Daltons stepped back into the street, the trap was already set. The first gunshot cracked the air like thunder. Then came another, and another. Within seconds, the street turned into a battlefield. Bullets shattered windows and ripped through wooden walls. Horses screamed and bolted. Smoke filled the air and people dove for cover. Bob Dalton fired back, shouting for his brothers. Emmett tried to reach him, but the air was thick with dust and gunfire. Across the street, Grat's group was pinned down. Bill Power took a bullet to the chest and fell instantly. Broadwell stumbled, hit in the back. The outlaws tried to fight their way to the alley where their horses waited, but every step brought more gunfire. The Daltons had always been fast, brave, and lucky. But in Coffeyville, luck ran out. Bob Dalton was hit once, twice, 3 times. He fell to the ground but kept firing until his revolver ran dry. Grat Dalton collapsed near the bank steps, shot in the throat. Emmett, desperate to help his brother, ran into the open. A shotgun blast tore through his hip and arm, dropping him beside Bob. For 15 minutes, the town echoed with gunfire, then silence. When the smoke cleared, 4 men lay dead. Bob Dalton, Grat Dalton, Bill Power, and Dick Broadwell. Only Emmett Dalton was still alive. Barely. He was riddled with bullets, bleeding out on the dusty street where he had once played as a child. The same people who had known him since boyhood now stood around him, silent and stunned. The Dalton Gang, the fearless outlaws who had robbed trains and mocked the law, were gone. And they hadn't died in the wilderness or on a lonely trail. They had died in their own hometown, surrounded by their own neighbors. News of the Coffeyville raid spread across the country within days. The story appeared in every newspaper from Kansas to New York. Headlines called it the most daring robbery in American history. The photographs of their lifeless bodies lying side by side were printed in black and white for the world to see. For the first time, people saw what outlaw glory really looked like, broken, bloody, and lifeless in the dirt. The people of Coffeyville became heroes overnight. They had stood up to the most feared gang in the West and won. But even in their victory, there was sorrow. Several townsmen had died in the fight, including Lucius Baldwin, the hardware store owner who had armed his friends. The cost of justice was heavy. For both sides, Emmett Dalton was taken to jail under heavy guard. Doctors didn't expect him to survive, but he did, and his survival made him the last living witness to one of the most famous gunfights in the history of the American West. The Dalton Gang's dream of greatness had ended in 15 minutes of chaos and gunfire. Bob's pride, Great's loyalty, and Emmett's love for his brothers had led them straight into disaster. They wanted to be remembered as legends, and they were. But not for triumph, for tragedy. Coffeyville, Kansas, became the graveyard of the Dalton Gang. The outlaws who once ruled the West died trying to make history, and in doing so, became a warning for generations to come. The Dalton Gang had become legends, young, fearless, and unstoppable. They had robbed trains, humiliated lawmen, and captured the world's attention. But their pride had grown faster than their luck, and soon it would all come crashing down in the streets of Coffeyville. The morning of October 5, 1892, was calm in Coffeyville, Kansas. The sun rose over the quiet town as people opened their shops, children hurried to school, and horses trotted down dusty streets. No one knew that death was coming. No one knew that the most infamous outlaw gang in America was riding straight toward them. The Dalton Gang was about to attempt something no one had ever done before: rob two banks at the same time. Narrator. 5 men rode into Coffeyville that morning: Bob Dalton, Grat Dalton, Emmett Dalton, Bill Power, and Dick Broadwell. They wore long coats and fake beards to hide their faces, but it didn't matter. This was their hometown. Too many people knew them. Their walk, their voices, even the way they carried their guns. Their plan was daring but simple. Bob, Emmett, and Power would rob the First National Bank. Grat and Broadwell would take the C.M. Condon Bank across the street. They would strike both banks at once, fill their bags with cash, and escape before anyone could react. Then they would ride out of town, vanish into the hills, and become legends forever. At least, that was the plan. As they entered town, something went wrong almost immediately. Their horses couldn't be tied up close to the banks. They had to leave them in an alley farther away. It was a small mistake, but in the world of outlaws, small mistakes mean death. The gang split up, walking casually through the morning crowd. But Coffeyville was a small town, and people recognized them. A store clerk whispered, "Aren't those the Dalton boys?" Within minutes, the warning spread. Shopkeepers ran for cover, and townsmen reached for their guns. The quiet morning turned into a storm waiting to explode. Inside the First National Bank, Bob Dalton barked orders. "Fill the sacks and make it quick." The terrified teller obeyed. Emmett stood by the door, gun drawn, watching the street. Outside, he could hear shouting. Something was wrong. Across the street, Grat and Broadwell were facing the same problem. The cashier at the C.M. Condon Bank told them the safe wouldn't open for another 10 minutes. He was lying, buying time. Grat didn't realize it. Every second lost meant more townsmen arming themselves outside. Soon Coffeyville was ready. Ordinary citizens, clerks, farmers, and shop owners grabbed rifles and revolvers. The hardware store owner, Lucius Baldwin, handed out guns to anyone brave enough to fight. Men took positions behind barrels, wagons, and doorways. They weren't trained soldiers, but they were protecting their town, and they had the element of surprise. When the Daltons stepped back into the street, the trap was already set. The first gunshot cracked the air like thunder. Then came another, and another. Within seconds, the street turned into a battlefield. Bullets shattered windows and ripped through wooden walls. Horses screamed and bolted. Smoke filled the air, and people dove for cover. Bob Dalton fired back, shouting for his brothers. Emmett tried to reach him, but the air was thick with dust and gunfire. Across the street, Grat's group was pinned down. Bill Power took a bullet to the chest and fell instantly. Broadwell stumbled, hit in the back. The outlaws tried to fight their way to the alley where their horses waited, but every step brought more gunfire. The Daltons had always been fast, brave, and lucky. But in Coffeyville, luck ran out. Bob Dalton was hit once, twice, 3 times. He fell to the ground but kept firing until his revolver ran dry. Grat Dalton collapsed near the bank steps, shot in the throat. Emmett, desperate to help his brother, ran into the open. A shotgun blast tore through his hip and arm, dropping him beside Bob. For 15 minutes, the town echoed with gunfire, then silence. When the smoke cleared, 4 men lay dead. Bob Dalton, Grat Dalton, Bill Power, and Dick Broadwell. Only Emmett Dalton was still alive, barely. He was riddled with bullets, bleeding out on the dusty street where he had once played as a child. The same people who had known him since boyhood now stood around him, silent and stunned. The Dalton Gang, the fearless outlaws who had robbed trains and mocked the law, were gone. And they hadn't died in the wilderness or on a lonely trail. They had died in their own hometown, surrounded by their own neighbors. News of the Coffeyville raid spread across the country within days. The story appeared in every newspaper from Kansas to New York. Headlines called it the most daring robbery in American history. The photographs of their lifeless bodies lying side by side were printed in black and white for the world to see. For the first time, people saw what outlaw glory really looked like, broken, bloody, and lifeless in the dirt. The people of Coffeyville became heroes overnight. They had stood up to the most feared gang in the West and won. But even in their victory, there was sorrow. Several townsmen had died in the fight, including Lucius Baldwin, the hardware store owner who had armed his friends. The cost of justice was heavy. For both sides, Emmett Dalton was taken to jail under heavy guard. Doctors didn't expect him to survive, but he did. And his survival made him the last living witness to one of the most famous gunfights in the history of the American West. The Dalton Gang's dream of greatness had ended in 15 minutes of chaos and gunfire. Bob's pride, Grat's loyalty, and Emmett's love for his brothers had led them straight into disaster. They wanted to be remembered as legends, and they were. But not for triumph, for tragedy. Coffeyville, Kansas, became the graveyard of the Dalton Gang. The outlaws who once ruled the West died trying to make history, and in doing so, became a warning for generations to come. When the gunfire ended in Coffeyville, Kansas, 4 men were dead and 1 was barely alive. His name was Emmett Dalton, the youngest of the brothers, the one who had followed them out of loyalty, not greed. He was lying on the ground, bleeding from more than 20 wounds, his life hanging by a thread. People said he wouldn't live through the night. But Emmett Dalton wasn't ready to die. Doctors worked on him for hours. They pulled bullets from his back, his arm, his hip. He lost so much blood that he drifted in and out of consciousness, hovering between life and death. When he finally opened his eyes, the world was different. His brothers were gone. The gang was gone. And the legend of the Dalton Gang was already spreading across America. Emmett, once part of the most feared group in the West, was now just a broken man in a jail cell. Narrator. The trial came quickly. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, eager to see the last living Dalton. Some cursed him. Others pitied him. The newspapers called him the boy outlaw. When asked why he did it, Emmett gave no excuses. He simply said, "I went with my brothers because they were my brothers." He was found guilty of robbery and murder and sentenced to life in prison at the Kansas State Penitentiary. He was only 21 years old. The gates closed behind him with a heavy clang. Emmett Dalton, once a free spirit of the frontier, was now prisoner number 6476. He was weak from his injuries and carried the scars of Coffeyville for the rest of his life. The guards watched him closely, some curious, some hateful. To them, he wasn't just another inmate. He was living history, the last Dalton. At first, Emmett kept to himself. He didn't talk much, didn't cause trouble. He spent his days in silence, working, reading, and thinking about everything that had happened. Every night, he dreamed of his brothers, of the gunfire, of the shouts, of their faces as they fell. Those memories never left him. Over time, Emmett began to change. Prison life was harsh, cold winters, hot summers, endless days of labor. But it gave him something he'd never had before, time to think. He started reading the Bible and old books that spoke about redemption and forgiveness. He learned that strength wasn't just about surviving bullets. It was about facing yourself and what you'd done. He often wrote letters to his mother, Adeline Dalton. She forgave him completely, calling him her boy who lost his way. Her love became the one thing that kept him going. Years passed. The Wild West outside the prison walls began to disappear. Railroads stretched farther, towns became cities, and law replaced chaos. The world that had made the Dalton Gang famous was fading into history. Inside his cell, Emmett watched that history pass him by. He was no longer an outlaw, he was a forgotten man. But deep inside, a quiet hope remained. Maybe one day he could start again. Maybe one day he could live as more than the last Dalton. In 1907, 14 years after Coffeyville, that chance finally came. Emmett Dalton was granted parole. He had served his time with good behavior, never once causing trouble. The man who entered prison as a reckless boy walked out as a changed man. When he stepped into the sunlight, the world felt strange and new. The frontier was gone. The old towns had grown into cities. The trains he once robbed now carried tourists instead of gold. The gunslingers were dead or forgotten. Emmett Dalton was the last of his kind. He moved to California and tried to live quietly. He found work, made new friends, and did his best to leave the past behind. But no matter where he went, people recognized his name. Some admired him. Some judged him. All wanted to hear his story. At first, he refused to talk about it. He didn't want to glorify the crimes that had killed his brothers. He said, "There's nothing romantic about what we did. It's just pain and loss." But as the years passed, he realized that people needed to know the truth, not the legend. So he began to write. In 1918, Emmett Dalton published his first book, Beyond the Law. It was part confession, part reflection. He told the real story of the Dalton brothers, their childhood, their choices, and their fall. He wrote about the Coffeyville raid, about what it felt like to see his brothers die, and about how he found faith again in prison. Readers were fascinated. They had grown up hearing wild tales about the Dalton Gang, but this was different. This was the voice of the man who had lived it. His honesty touched people. He didn't make excuses. He didn't seek glory. He simply told the truth. A few years later, Emmett wrote another book, When the Daltons Rode. It was adapted into a Hollywood film, with Emmett himself serving as a consultant. The movie showed the human side of the outlaws, their mistakes, their loyalty, and their downfall. Emmett became something unexpected, not an outlaw, not a hero, but a storyteller. A man who had seen the worst of life and still found a way to start over. He married a woman named Julia Johnson and lived peacefully in California. People who met him in his later years described him as calm, polite, and soft-spoken. He rarely talked about Coffeyville unless someone asked directly. When he did, his eyes filled with sadness. He always ended the story the same way. He would say, "I followed my brothers because I loved them, and I paid the price for it." That simple sentence carried the weight of a lifetime. Emmett Dalton lived to the age of 66, passing away in 1937. He was the last survivor of the Dalton Gang, the last echo of a violent time now long gone. He had spent half his life trying to forget the other half, and in doing so became a symbol of something rare in the Old West, redemption. Emmett Dalton's story is not about a hero or a villain. It's about a man who made terrible choices and found the courage to face them. He lived through betrayal, pain, and loss, and still managed to rebuild his life. He proved that even an outlaw can change, that even a life of crime can end with forgiveness. The Dalton Gang died in Coffeyville, but through Emmett their story lived on, not as a tale of glory, but as a warning, and a lesson about the cost of pride. Time has a strange way of turning tragedy into legend. Years after the gunfire faded in Coffeyville, the story of the Dalton Gang still echoed through the dusty streets of the American West. The brothers were gone, their graves marked with simple stones, yet their names refused to be forgotten. The tale of Bob, Grat, and Emmett Dalton became more than a story about outlaws. It became a reflection of the Wild West itself, bold, reckless, dangerous, and unforgettable. Long before Hollywood, the Dalton Gang had already become a myth. People told stories around campfires in saloons and on trains about the brothers who dared to rob two banks at once. Some made them heroes, brave men fighting against injustice. Others painted them as cold-blooded killers. The truth, as always, lived somewhere in between. They weren't devils. They weren't saints. They were human, men shaped by poverty, pride, and the unforgiving world they were born into. In those final years after Coffeyville, as the frontier faded and civilization spread, people began to romanticize the outlaw life. Newspapers, dime novels, and traveling storytellers turned the Daltons into larger-than-life characters. They exaggerated every detail. The robberies became grander, the shootouts bloodier, and the brothers braver than ever. But Emmett Dalton, the last living brother, always tried to correct the myth. He said we weren't heroes. We weren't villains. We were just boys who made bad choices and paid for them. That honesty made his story even more powerful. When Emmett published his books, Beyond the Law and When the Daltons Rode, people saw the gang through new eyes. They weren't just outlaws anymore. They were sons, brothers, and dreamers. The world began to understand the Dalton story not as a tale of glory, but as a lesson about ambition, loyalty, and fate. Hollywood soon took notice. In 1940, Universal Pictures released When the Daltons Rode, a major motion picture based on Emmett's book. The movie turned their tragedy into entertainment for a new generation. Filled with gunfights, drama, and emotion. It wasn't perfectly accurate, but it kept the Dalton name alive. And through the years, more films, books, and TV shows followed. The Daltons became symbols of the Wild West, flawed men chasing a dream that could never last. Even today, more than a century later, the Dalton Gang's story still fascinates people. Historians write about them. Tourists visit Coffeyville, Kansas, where the raid took place. The town has museums, plaques, and even bullet holes in old buildings that still bear the marks of that day. Every October, the town commemorates the Coffeyville raid, honoring the townspeople who fought back and remembering the outlaws who made history. Visitors can walk the same streets, stand where the banks once stood, and imagine the moment the Daltons rode in for their final stand. It's as if time stands still, frozen in that morning sunlight of 1892. But beyond the fame and fascination, the story of the Dalton Gang holds something deeper. It's not about guns or money. It's about choices. It's about how pride can blind even the best men, how loyalty can turn dangerous, and how love for family can both save and destroy. Bob Dalton wanted to be greater than Jesse James. He wanted the world to remember his name. And he got what he wanted, but not the way he imagined. The world remembered him not for success, but for the price he paid chasing it. Grat, loyal and steady, followed his brother to the end, a reminder that sometimes love and obedience can lead a man to his death. And Emmett, the youngest, lived long enough to tell the tale. Proof that even after a life of sin, redemption is possible. The Dalton story also marked the end of an era. After Coffeyville, the age of outlaws began to fade. Lawmen became stronger, railroads safer, and telegraphs connected every town. The Wild West, that chaotic world where one man could defy the law, was disappearing. In a way, the Dalton Gang's fall symbolized the death of the old frontier. They were among the last true outlaws to live and die by the gun. After them came order, progress, and the slow taming of the American West. Yet somehow, the legend never truly died. Songs were written about them. Novels romanticized them. Even comic books and cartoons in later years portrayed the Daltons, changing their faces and names, but keeping their spirit alive. The world loves stories about rebellion, about people who defy rules, even when those stories end in tragedy. And the Dalton Gang, with their courage and their downfall, became the perfect reminder of that eternal truth. Freedom always comes with a price. Today, if you visit the old Elmwood Cemetery in Coffeyville, you can still see their graves, simple headstones standing quietly among the grass. People leave coins, flowers, and notes, some in respect, some in curiosity. Time has softened their image, turning outlaws into legends, and legends into history. Standing there, it's hard not to wonder what they might have become if they had chosen a different path. Would Bob have become a great lawman like his brother Frank? Would Grat have built a family? Would Emmett have lived a quiet, honest life? No one will ever know. But their story reminds us that even in failure, some men leave behind something lasting. A lesson, a warning, and a name that time refuses to erase. The Dalton Gang began as lawmen and ended as legends. They lived fast, died young, and left behind one of the greatest tales of the American frontier. Their story is about brothers bound by blood, ambition and love, men who tried to outrun their fate but couldn't escape the truth. The Wild West made them famous, but it also destroyed them. In the end, the Daltons got what they wanted. They were remembered forever, but not as heroes. As a reminder that even legends bleed and that no man, no matter how bold, can outrun destiny.